And there are moments in history that don't come with headlines, but they echo louder than any breaking news. Nights when the balance of power doesn't shift with a roar, but with a silence so heavy the world doesn't know how to respond. This is about one of those nights. A night when a nation long underestimated stepped out of the shadows, not with chaos, but with clarity. A night when pride was pierced without a word. When missiles carried more than warheads, they carried a message. And the world stayed silent. This isn't just about Iran. It's not just about Israel. It's about what happens when restraint becomes power, when silence becomes strategy, and when those you counted out start rewriting the rules. So stay with me. What you're about to hear isn't just a speech. It's a perspective the world isn't ready to admit. But once you've heard it, you won't forget it. Iran's retaliation was not a reckless act of revenge. It was a measured and methodical response, calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact without plunging the region into all-out war. The decision to strike came not from rage, but from resolve. Iran had been under mounting pressure for years, facing sanctions, military threats, and strategic isolation. Yet when it responded to provocation, it did so with discipline that surprised even its critics. Every missile launched wasn't just aimed at a military site. It was aimed at the narrative that Iran was either unwilling or unable to defend its sovereignty. The timing, targets, and intensity of the operation reflected not chaos, but control. This retaliation was steeped in symbolism. It wasn't about how many targets were hit. It was about which ones were chosen and why. By carefully selecting military sites associated with Israeli defense infrastructure, Iran signaled it was capable of precision and strategic depth. It wanted to send a message: we are not attacking blindly. We are asserting red lines. That kind of clarity is rare in a region plagued by proxy wars and unpredictable escalations. Iran, often accused of acting through third parties, chose to act directly, yet responsibly, without striking civilians or major international interests. This distinction reinforced the idea that Iran's military capacity was not just about brute force, but about controlled power. What truly underscored the calculated nature of the strike was the aftermath. Iran did not boast unnecessarily or escalate further. It let the world absorb what had just happened. That restraint in communication, the deliberate lack of bravado, was part of the strategy. It knew the action would speak louder than any press release. The world, especially its rivals, was forced to reckon with a new image of Iran, one that could strike effectively and still maintain composure. This retaliation shifted the perception of Iran from a reactive actor to a player capable of initiating calibrated, direct responses under extreme provocation. It unsettled long-held assumptions about who controls escalation in the Middle East. Iran demonstrated that it could flip the chessboard without flipping the table. In doing so, it redefined the rules of engagement in a region where calculated strength has become more powerful than loud defiance. When Iran launched its calculated strike, what followed wasn't global outrage or immediate condemnation. It was silence. That silence wasn't accidental. It was revealing. In a world used to swift reactions and synchronized statements from global powers, the absence of collective response spoke louder than any press briefing ever could. The usual actors, who often raced to either defend or denounce, hesitated. And in that hesitation lay a shift. The international community, long vocal about Iran's every move, found itself unsure of how to respond to a nation that didn't lash out, but responded with surgical precision and visible restraint. But the silence wasn't just from governments. It echoed in the media, in alliances, in diplomatic corridors. There were no urgent emergency sessions at the UN, no rallying cries from powerful blocs. It was as if the world realized that Iran's strike, though bold, was not irrational. It was not wild. It was grounded in the logic of deterrence, of response, not provocation. For years, the global stage had grown accustomed to casting Iran in a singular light, a nation on the edge, unpredictable, dangerous. But when that same nation moved with deliberate force and then chose silence over spectacle, the script began to unravel. But this silence reveals its geopolitical fatigue and shifting interests. Nations, especially those in the West, are now more cautious in openly defending unilateral actions in the region. The Middle East is no longer a one-story theater. New alliances, rising powers, and changing public perceptions have made the old language of blame less effective. Many countries, watching from a distance, realize that condemning Iran in this moment could expose double standards that no longer go unnoticed. The restraint in reactions was also driven by fear of escalation, fear of exposure, and fear of admitting that Iran had executed a show of force without losing control. This silence was strategic, not apathetic. By not speaking, global powers gave room for recalibration. It showed that even adversaries had to process this move carefully. The lack of noise was not a lack of notice. It was the world grappling with the uncomfortable truth that Iran, often spoken about as a problem, had acted with a kind of discipline that forced quiet respect. The silence became its own message, an acknowledgement without endorsement, a pause born from recognition rather than confusion. For decades, Iran has been portrayed through a narrow lens: aggressor, instigator, outlier. Global narratives often positioned it as the perpetual problem in the region, the actor that needed containment rather than consideration. But on that pivotal night, when Iran responded with measured force and clear intent, the country that was so often painted as a victim of sanctions, isolation, and external pressure began to rewrite its role, not as one pleading for justice, but as one capable of enforcing it on its own terms. This was not an emotional outburst. It was a demonstration of self-determined strength. Iran stepped out of the corner it had been pushed into and stood at the center of the arena, not to plead its case, but to prove its capacity. This narrative transformation didn't come through words, it came through the clarity of its action. The response was not cloaked in chaos or masked by proxies. It was direct, visible, strategic. And in doing so, Iran altered the way it was being perceived, not just by its adversaries, but by observers across the world, especially in the global south and the broader Islamic world. Many who once viewed Iran with suspicion began to reconsider. Here was a nation that had been under siege economically and diplomatically, yet remained unbroken in its stance, unbowed in its identity. By hitting back and then refusing to spiral into further conflict, Iran projected not desperation, but dignity. This was the moment when Iran stopped being seen solely as the one absorbing pressure and started being seen as one capable of creating it. That shift in perception is powerful. It changes diplomacy, it changes dialogue, it reshapes how enemies calculate risk and how allies assess commitment, and most importantly, it inspires a reevaluation among nations and people who once assumed that power only resided in those backed by Western coalitions or financial empires. Our strike was a pivot point, not just militarily, morally in the eyes of many. Iran reclaimed its voice, not in defiance of international order, but in demand of fair recognition within it. No longer merely reactive, Iran positioned itself as a vanguard of resistance and autonomy. That night wasn't just about retaliation, it was a deliberate repositioning, a redefining. And with every missile that flew, so did an unspoken message. We are not what you say we are. We are what we choose to be. The core of Iran's operation wasn't to claim territory or inflict mass casualties. It was aimed at something far more symbolic: Israel's pride. For years, Israel has maintained a powerful image of military dominance, technological superiority, and impenetrable defense. The Iron Dome, the intelligence network, and the swift response mechanisms have all contributed to a reputation of invincibility. But on that night, Iran challenged that image directly, not by overwhelming force, but by calculated strikes that showed it could reach what was once considered untouchable. The objective was psychological, not territorial. Iran's goal was to pierce the myth, not the border. This wasn't just about showing strength, it was about exposing vulnerability. The fact that missiles crossed the airspace, triggered alarms, and struck strategic areas sent a ripple far beyond the physical damage. It questioned the belief that Israel could act without consequence, that its actions would never invite a direct and effective counterblow. The pride that was bruised wasn't just military, it was national, ideological, and geopolitical. The precision of Iran's strikes didn't need to topple buildings to shake foundations, it needed only to show that dominance is no longer a one-sided narrative. The moment Israel's defensive aura took a hit, so did a layer of its strategic posture in the region. Allies and rivals alike observed that even the most fortified nations can be reached. This shift has implications not just for Israel's military planners, but for the entire balance of psychological power in the Middle East. Iran's message was sharp and clear. We do not seek to destroy, but we will not be dismissed. And that subtle distinction is what gave their response such weight. It wasn't the number of missiles. It was the intent behind them and the perception they altered. This type of strike reflects a deep understanding of modern warfare, where perception and narrative often weigh heavier than tanks or troops. By aiming at pride rather than people, Iran avoided global moral backlash while still achieving a strategic blow. It wasn't about escalation, it was about demonstration, demonstrating that the rules have changed, that Iran can be mocked, provoked, or sidelined without consequence. And in doing so, it didn't just attack a nation, it targeted a myth of invincibility, of untouchable superiority, which, once cracked, doesn't simply repair with time, it lingers, and it redefines every confrontation that follows. Iran's strike on Israel was not delivered in isolation. It was a message layered with intent, not only for its direct adversary, but for the entire geopolitical stage. While the visible target was Israel, the real audience extended far beyond its borders. Every regional actor, every global power observing the Middle East was meant to feel the ripple of what Iran had done. This was not an emotional response born out of rage. It was a statement carefully crafted to assert presence, resilience, and the refusal to be pushed into a corner. Iran wasn't just confronting Israel, it was confronting the narrative that it could be checked, cornered, or humiliated without consequence. To its adversaries in the Gulf, the message was clear. Alignments with hostile actors will not go unnoticed. Iran made it known that any regional power acting as a launchpad or silent partner in aggression will eventually feel the weight of strategic consequence. Tehran was not looking for direct conflict with every neighbor, but it reminded them of the balance they must maintain if they wish to avoid becoming part of a wider battlefield. This response served as a reminder that Iran remains a force capable of both reach and resolve, especially when provoked. To its allies, particularly those engaged in proxy networks or ideological alignment, Iran's move reaffirmed its role as a committed guardian of resistance. It showed that Iran would not only talk the language of defiance, but also act when red lines are crossed. It reinforced trust among its partners that Iran is not a hesitant supporter, but a responsive leader, willing to absorb risks and take calculated action. This gesture of retaliation was an anchor point, reassuring allies that they are not alone in their posture against oppression or aggression. And to the world's superpowers, the message was equally pointed. Iran displayed that it could challenge a nuclear-armed nation with Western backing and do so without losing strategic control. It reminded those powers that Iran is not just surviving under sanctions and pressure, it is adapting, evolving, and finding new ways to assert itself without being drawn into the traps of reckless escalation. It made clear that Iran's strategic patience is not weakness, but a choice, and that when it does act, it does so in ways that demand recalibration, not retaliation. This moment of action reverberated as a declaration. Iran's silence should never be mistaken for submission, and its response is not just for one enemy, but for every observer who still underestimates its depth. In the aftermath of Iran's calculated strike revealed a profound truth. Power does not always announce itself with noise. In a world dominated by loud displays, viral headlines, and declarations of supremacy, Iran's most powerful move came not only from what it did, but from what it didn't do. It didn't seek applause. It didn't boast. It didn't flood the airwaves with self-congratulation. Instead, it let the actions speak, and the silence that followed became its own statement. The world paused, not in confusion, but in contemplation, because what was displayed was not just military capability, it was emotional discipline, strategic maturity, and a new kind of influence rooted in restraint. This moment exposed the contrast between traditional power and emerging influence. Traditionally, power has been defined by who can shout the loudest, who can dominate the narrative, who can gather the biggest coalition of allies. But Iran showed that influence today is earned not just through firepower, but through control, through the ability to strike when necessary and then choose stillness over spectacle. That is the kind of power that leaves opponents unsettled. It disrupts the playbook. It forces a recalibration of assumptions. Iran didn't just retaliate, it revealed how silence can carry more weight than 1,000 declarations. The world's muted response wasn't just about politics or alliances, it was an acknowledgement, even if unspoken, that Iran had crossed a threshold. It had moved beyond being reactive, and had stepped into the role of an actor that chooses its timing, its messaging, and its mode of engagement. That level of control reflects something deeper than capability. It reflects confidence, not in dominance, but in presence, in the knowledge that true power doesn't need validation to be real. It doesn't need global endorsement to exist. Observers across the region and beyond noticed this shift. It challenged the stereotype of Iran as unpredictable and aggressive. Instead, it presented a state that had made its point, not through destruction, but through direction, through a response that was purposeful, disciplined, and without the need for dramatic justification. The strike did enough to be felt, but restrained enough to avoid further chaos. That fine line is where real influence lives. It is where fear turns to respect, and where silence becomes not an absence of response, but a calculated echo of strength that lingers long after the missiles fall. What unfolded that night was more than a military operation. It was a rewriting of perception, a calculated demonstration of resolve that pierced deeper than the sound of missiles. Iran didn't just strike back. It reclaimed a narrative that had been shaped without its voice for too long. It reminded the world that dignity cannot be sanctioned, that silence does not mean surrender, and that true strength often moves in stillness. Pride was challenged, myths were shattered, and a global audience was left to grapple with a new truth. That power is not always about volume, but about precision, patience, and presence. The night Iran rose was the night the world chose to watch quietly, and in that quiet, everything changed. Thank you for watching and reflecting with an open mind. May this message ignite deeper thought, stronger purpose, and a renewed sense of awareness in you. Stay bold, stay principled, and may your voice always stand for truth. Good luck on your journey, and until next time, peace and strength be with you.